So all of this is going on in Europe, as David Hume is also writing the classic book on empiricism, on the essay, on human understanding, and his work, which is certainly worth reading. Humean empiricism is very important, especially to the tradition of philosophy that has to do with American pragmatism and the post-Kantian moment. So anyway, I want to situate the idealism vis-a-vis Kant, right? Not only Kant's philosophical writings, but really the whole question of what does it mean to be an enlightened human being, and what does it mean to live in an age or an era of enlightenment, or do we live in an enlightened age, or are we now in a pre-enlightened age? Three questions we can pose, right? And I'm trying to do here what has been termed the archaeology of the present, the Enlightenment as part of our present condition. So where we're going, let me just point out a crucial date here. 1770, Hegel is born, Beethoven is born, and Holderlin is born. Very crucial year, obviously, in terms of major births. The major German poet, right? The major German philosopher of German idealism, as well as, of course, the major composer, of that period, and musician. So it's a very interesting moment in him. We're reading tonight what is Enlightenment. 1784 is the date of this, which precedes the French Revolution by five years. And obviously Kant's tremendous influence here is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Tremendous influence in terms of the age. So I don't know if you had a chance to read it. I doubt it, right? I mean, you did? You read it? You read it? Okay, good. Everybody read it? Oh, great. Okay, fantastic. Good. All right. So where we're going, so we'll do this tonight, right? And then next week, I'm going to start assigning texts from Hegel. I would like to do parts of the Phenomenology. We're not going to get through this. This would be a year-long project to do justice to.
I have the Miller translation.
That's what we're using, the 1976 A.V. Miller translation. That's the paperback. I have the old hardbound. It's really beat up and marked on almost every page.
I studied with Agnes Heller. Do you know her from the?
I just wrote a homage to her.
I studied.
I knew Agnes.
Phenomenology with her.
You did? Where? At the new school?
At the new school, yeah.
Oh.
I was back in those days. I was allowed to audit for nothing. No.
And you would go to
can't
Agnes's
do that
classes?
anymore.
Yeah. I just wrote for situations. I'll give you a copy of it. I just wrote a homage. She just passed away.
Oh, she did?
She was swimming in Hungary, and she died while swimming. 90 years old.
Oh,
Yep.
well,
She had an
good way to
accent,
go.
but I can still understand her. She had an Hungarian accent, I think. But
Oh,
I
yes,
can still
very much.
understand her.
Yeah. So anyway, okay, so what I think I'm going to do is try to run us through both the introduction and then some of the crucial terms of the preface next week. This is very difficult stuff. Again, I want to take it slow, but I do want to situate it vis-a-vis, a philosophical core in German idealism, since most of the work today is really still a response to Hegel, to the notion of the totality, absolute knowing, absolute spirit, and we'll talk about those terms as we go forward. So I'm going to, concentrate on this for a good part of the term, right? At the same time, I will point to, some of the crucial readings, and I can make a packet. Kojève, obviously, Lacan's master, was, the major Hegelian, but he had his own interpretation of Hegel, right? It was not a close reading of Hegel. He took Hegel to really a kind of dimension that, was unheard of at that time. His lectures on the reading of Hegel, as well as Jean Hippolyte and Genesis and Structure, actually attuned us to the sense and sensitized us to the careful reading of Hegel textually. So there are two great names in French Hegelian studies. So you can look at it this way in terms of the 20th century, Kojève, right? Alexander Kojève, and Jean Hippolyte. Both very good friends of Lacan, Althusser and Foucault's and Deleuze's teacher, Jean Hippolyte. And in fact, Gilles Deleuze wrote a very good review of his book, Logic and Existence, in the 1950s, which is a great introduction to Hegel. So I'm going to make you a copy of that on La Logique et l'Existence, but it's in English, so don't worry. So we're going to do that. And then Kojève from 1933 to 1939, the lectures. So very, very important. So Hippolyte, the studies in Marx and Hegel, and Logic et Existence. And of course, if you're really interested in Hegel and you want to struggle through this at a very high level, Genesis and Structure is still one of the best textual studies of Hegel. Genesis and Structure of the Phenomenology, right? And we're going to talk about what is Hegelian phenomenology. I'm going to try to define these things. I want to make us, at least again, attuned to the language. It's not Husserlian phenomenology. It's not Kantian phenomenalization, but a very different kind of phenomenology in Hegel. And also the word Geist, I feel. The word spirit, Geist, we're going to reinterpret that as well, as both community and spirit in a different way, okay? It's usually been translated, first translations of Hegel into English were Phenomenology of Mind, and then Phenomenology of Spirit, which is basically what Miller and Finley did, okay? I'll speak a little bit to the British idealists who took up Hegel, but that, to me they're virtually unimportant. F.H. Bradley, etc. But very important to people like T.S. Eliot and some of the poetic tradition in England and the expatriates. But I'll point that out. Bradley was read the book Appearance and Reality by Eliot. But I'm going to really concentrate both on the German and the French readings of Hegel, and then what was risked against the system. As most of you know that have been, taking classes, Althusser was very anti-Hegelian. There was a displacement away from Hegel, particularly because of the methodological problem of the negation of the negation. And we'll talk about contradiction and what that really did and how Althusser makes the move to Spinoza. So the French scene is Marx and Spinoza.
How do you spell that name? 1933.
Kojève, Alexander Kojève.
K-O...
O-J-O-V. I'm sorry, it's a bad. Yeah, maybe the pink would be better. The dark blue. Yeah. K-O-J. E. Now these are all bad. Okay. Yeah. All right, Kojève. He was the founder of the General Agreement of Tariffs, and GATT. He was the founder of that. He was de Gaulle's Minister of Economics after the war. But he continued to be, a major player and was writing a huge history of philosophy, going back to the ancients through the pagans, etc. Massive mind. Probably the modern Hegel, Alexander Kojève. I mean, in terms of modernity or World War I and following. And Lacan, I have letters that Lacan wrote him, about his classes, was there for every one of them. And in fact, Lacan's style of lecturing, the oral style, was very much taken from Kojève. This was a major event in Paris, 1933 to 39. The other major event, of course, was George Pelias, giving workers' education courses in dialectics. These were the two big moments of the resistance, if you will, intellectually, in Paris. That's the way the movie kind of unfolds. All right, so we'll do this. These are the two major readings of which spawned another generation of Hegelians, and we'll speak about some of the contemporary Hegelians as well, people that are gone back to a kind of Hegelian moment, as Hegel is not idealist, but Hegel is materialist, of which Frederick Jameson would be one of the people who's done this. It's a kind of, traditional thing where Ludwig Feuerbach, in the end of classical philosophy, to put this in the Marxist tradition, is basically, I don't know if you know this book. Phil probably knows it, right? Ludwig Feuerbach and the end of German classical German philosophy. And classical refers to Hegel. Marx and Engels both referred to Hegel as dead dog. Okay? And then they resuscitated him about the method. Of course, Marxists are still running around reading the logic. You'll probably get this with Arto about looking for the logic of capital in Hegel's logic, because Marx was reading Hegel's logic when he was writing Capital. So there's a lot to be said for that. So this is Engels, who wrote this. So the Marxist tradition always put Hegel in this kind of idealist position, and simplistically, matter was inversion, right, for spirit. So as the phenomenology of matter was being replaced for Geist throughout. This kind of very elementary, kind of superficial, reductionistic materialism was played out by Engels and that tradition, right? Obviously, Lukács, so many of you know, is very Hegelian, right? Especially in History and Class Consciousness. The chapter on reification and class consciousness of the proletariat is an extremely rich Hegelian work, and his concentration is on the concept of the totality, which he gets from Hegel, and we'll talk about that as well. So German idealism has these great traditions. There are other, Hegelian Marxists, but Lukács is the fundamental one of the 20th century, right? In a sense. Yeah. So we'll be concentrating on that. What I want to do is with Hegel, and I'll go back to Kant, since we don't really have much time tonight. I don't have the usual 4 hours. But the major thing here is how to think of this, Hegel in terms of historicity, right? The history of the idealist tradition. What is the master-slave dialectic really trying to do, right? Well, ultimately, how does this play out? Everything from liberation struggles to Fanon to of course, Susan Buck-Morss's attempt to look at this as a reflection on Toussaint and the Santo Domingo slave uprising. Minerva, which was the journal, was reporting on Santo Domingo all the time. So they had a journal called Minerva, a philosophical journal. So Hegel was well aware of this. The question is, was Hegel really reflecting when he was writing Lordship and Bondage, right, on this actual historical moment? Or is this a product of, Buck-Morss's historicism, which he's been criticized for? Or is it something that goes much larger out there? So we'll talk about recognition, we'll talk about interiorization, we'll talk about, the struggle for prestige, which is very active in the Lacanian framework too. And again, Lacan avec Hegel and Lacan against Hegel is also another thing that happens in psychoanalysis. To the best of my knowledge, Freud never really read Hegel. So you don't really have that psychoanalytic movement with him. Lacan, certainly, because he's friends with Kojève, right? And Hippolyte, who attended many of his seminars. And in fact, Hippolyte wrote a piece, a very Hegelian piece, on Freudian denial on Verneinen, right? And Lacan commented on it. It's a 5-page piece that he did early in Lacan's seminars. So this becomes a very, very active thing that's taken up, that's really started in France in 1929 by Jean Moll. So Hegel is suppressed, if you will, from the French academic tradition. I want you to understand, because he's out of favor, completely. Hegel went the way of Russia through Plekhanov and then through Lenin in one way, right? The other way went through the English, through F.H. Bradley, He was anglicized, right, in the United States through the Washington School of Hegelians, the St. Louis Hegelians, of which W.E.B. Du Bois was a member of that group. So I'm going to try to do some of those migrations too, and maybe show how different schools picked up on German idealism. That's what I mean about the philosophical reactions or the philosophical, points that were taken up after Hegel. Okay? So another thing I want to read, I mean, it's this is again Schelling, his good friend. He, Schelling, and Hölderlin planted a tree of liberty, right? And during the French Revolution, and as most of you know, Germany was trying to catch up politically with the French and economically with the British imperialists when Hegel was on the scene. So this and the British colonies. But this is important on human freedom. So I have some selections from this. Zizek, who some of you heard last week, has a lot to say about Schelling in his books on Hegel. Less Than Zero. The book on radical negativity. I forgot the title of it, but anyway, there's a lot about Schelling in there and the relationship to Hegel. They were very good friends. Schelling was the popular teacher, but then Hegel started to draw a lot of the students and took from him. Schelling came out of a more Spinozist tradition, right? Whereas Hegel's main arguments were with Kant, and we'll talk about that too as we go on. All right, so I can make you, or you can buy the book. I mean, this is worth reading as a symbol. It's called The Philosophical Investigations into the Essence of Human Freedom, right? And this is the Sunni edition, very good translation, and a good introduction by Schmidt. Yeah, Johannes Schmidt.
May I just say quickly?
Yeah, of course.
Something that Rick Wolff mentioned when I was taking a class. He said that Hegel is taught in Catholic universities.
Yeah, of course. Hegel has a very religious
kind of
moment. Yeah.
It shouldn't surprise me.
No, it's not surprising at all. No, I know many people that are, Christic Marxists, liberation theologists, who swear by Hegel, and that basically the sections on, absolute spirit is really absolute knowing with God, and that there are all kinds of things about the incarnation there, etc. That is not going to be my reading, but there is a reading, and I can point you. I mean, I know some of the people who have done this, etc. Yeah.
Jack O'Dell says that Martin Luther King was a Hegelian.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Well, he wrote. King wrote on Paul Tillich.
Yeah.
Who kind of came out of that tradition too, systematic theology and the courage to be, which was a kind of existential Hegel. So you have an existential Hegel, a Marxist Hegel, Christian Hegel, all of these amalgamations and taking up of, concepts. And it's our job really to kind of take these concepts and see what we can do with them in terms of a materialistic fashion in the real sense of not just substituting matter for spirit, right? And we can talk about this. So that's one thing I'm going to do. And the other thing would be the poetic reactions. I want to read Mallarme, who went mad reading this book. So I want to read Every Revolution is the Throw of the Die. Right? Is dead. Right? And we're going to read this against this in some ways. And I may, if I can get a copy of it, I sold my copy years ago, of Glas Derrida's Risk. This was a major disaster to the publishing house of Gallimard, right? They lost a fortune. They almost went out of business. They published a book of Derrida, which was 2 columns. One was the Hegelian system, and the other side was Jean Genet having been orphaned and being raised out of public assistance. And can one escape the Hegelian system? So we're going to talk about the difference between system and method in Hegel as well, right? And some of the risks that Derrida took. Of course, the bell tolls. Who for whom does the bell toll, right? And they almost went out of business because of this work. But it was really written like an old Talmudic scholar, double columns, where on the one side is Jean Genet risking, his public assistance, orphan consciousness, against the Hegelian system. Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned Genet.
Yeah.
A week ago, as I went to Strand, I wanted to, an anthology of his plays. Not his I read a few of his novels. They can be a bit tedious, boring, you know. But
We wrote them on
but
toilet.
the plays, Les Noirs, the Blacks, is magnificent. The
Yes,
Balcon,
one of the greatest plays ever
the
written
balconies
about
take
race.
place in a
Yes.
brothel and so forth.
Yeah, well, the
The Maids.
is a major
They're
film,
magnificent.
and the Maids was about, you know, I know you have an interest in Lacan, but the Papin sisters, you know, the two sisters that killed their mistress. Yeah, okay, so Solange and the two, and the Maids, this was a famous play that was taken up. It was
Plays
based
are
on,
hard to
and this
come
was
by.
Lacan's dissertation, was part of his analysis of the Papin sisters, right?
The plays are hard to come by. They didn't have any.
Really? Okay.
At Strand.
Well, French in France. You know, he's the most read author in French prisons, number one. And the major work is The Thief's Journal,
Yeah.
right? And Spinoza's number 5, The Ethics.
There's a production of The Maids that comes through like most years, I feel like, in New York. I see that going
Okay.
a lot.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's good. Balcony, Shelley Winters and Peter Falk played in the American film theater. It's great.
That's a
Shelley
great-
Winters was the madam and Peter Falk was the chief of police. And it's something worth reading given the whole, you know, Jeffrey Epstein, you know, this whole Weinstein, this whole culture, you know, that has been built up over the last
Have you ever
30,
read this
40
novel called Pompe Funèbre? Funeral?
Yeah, funeral rites, yeah.
That's good.
Yeah, sure, that's another one.
That's
Yeah, Our Lady of the Flowers, right?
That got boring because
Yeah.
he kept on talking about the carryings on, which is okay, of
Yeah.
the gay prisoners.
Yeah, yeah.
But it got repetitious.
Well, Genet never read Hegel, but Genet was, you know, Sartre was in a way another Hegelian Marxist. You can actually trace a long history from Lukács to Sartre here. You know, the thinkers of totality, the thinker of totalization, and of course Sartre, the return to subjectivity, you know, in search for a method and the critique of dialectical reason, which again is an attempt to look at Kantian dialectics in the light of a Hegelian dialectic that totalizes, you know, and becomes a spiraling. Yeah. So Sartre becomes really the antagonist in going back to Derrida. You know, there are many layers of reading here, but the Glas was an attempt to kind of take away Sartre's reading of Genet, right, as existential choice and do a textual reading, you know, which is what Derrida did, was textual reading. The text was the world. In a sense, there wasn't that major separation that went on. Whereas in Sartre's case, it was the humanist, you know, choices of Genet that really counted. I choose to be a thief. You know, it's a brilliant psychoanalytic study. Brilliant. I mean, it's really kind of a model for existential psychoanalysis.
Peace Journal?
No, it's called Saint Genet.
Oh, Saint Genet.
Yeah, Saint Genet.
Actor
Saint Genet.
and martyr.
Yeah, actor and martyr. Right. Yeah, that's right. Comedian. Yeah.
I read a little bit of it. It's very long.
Very long. Yeah. Genet couldn't write for 5 years after that book came out. So anyway, all right. All to say, you have these Hegelian Marxist traces, right, from Lukács all the way to Sartre, you know, and in some ways, you know, still goes on today in some cases, you know, even though the Althusserian moment has infiltrated the academy much more, right, in a sense, they have much better machinery going on. The Sartrean moment was very active back in the day, you know, with Hazel Wines and company. And there's a new translation, by the way, of Being and Nothingness, which you know, again, is a phenomenological ontology, which is filled with Hegel, Husserl, and Heidegger, you know, the 3 H's. So that brings me to another thing. So the poetical reactions, I also probably going to look at symbolic poetry as a way out of, quote, the Hegelian system, maybe at Rimbaud in particular. I thought we could do a close reading of his great poem, Democracy, you know, since it's an election year.
What?
Democracy by Arthur Rimbaud. It's a brilliant poem.
Le Bateau Ivre.
Yes, the drunken boat.
That's
Yeah. The drunken boat is a beautiful poem. But I want to read Democracy. It's a very sophisticated poem, and you know, that kind of has some moment. So I will look at this and maybe a few other people too, on this, and we'll talk about this. So that's where we're generally going. I hope we can, get into depth into the Hegelian system and the method. And I'll be making, some moves there. Of course, in the German context, the Frankfurt School, Adorno, for those of you interested in this, Adorno, Karl Korsch, in the tradition, the Leninist, right, had very much of an affinity to Hegel, in his way. So he wrote Marxism and Philosophy, which was an attempt to, look at Hegel through a materialist lens, right, a Marxist lens. But after Korsch, of course, Adorno. Negative dialectics is an attempt to look at, again, a very sophisticated analysis of phenomenology, of Husserl and Heideggerian hermeneutics, where Adorno is using the negativity of the dialectic to hit at hermeneutics and the framing of certain concepts and categories that go on in Husserl and Heidegger. Also against epistemology, well, it was translated, it's really knowledge critique, meta knowledge critique in German that Adorno writes. So you have this Hegelian Marxism, and of course Marcuse in 1931 with Heidegger writes on historicity, a philosophy of history based on Hegel's work. So you have that tradition as well, the Frankfurt School. Yeah, so I'm trying to give you a broad, picture here. You probably know a lot of this already, but there are these tendencies. The Frankfurt School, the school of the French, right? Jean Wall is the first because his name is Jean Wall. 1929 writes a book called The Unhappy Consciousness, right? On Hegel's unhappy conscissness, and that section we're going to read definitely. Unhappy and unhappy consciousness and the shapes of consciousness of Bewusstsein, the gestalts, the forms that really that happen throughout the phenomenology. So we're going to read that section carefully. Okay, and then the other part of the Hegel, like I said, Du Bois and company, it never really settled well in the United States, although there was a kind of renaissance in Hegel studies during the 70s and the 80s. George Armstrong Kelly, who lived in New York, the Hegel Society of America is on the Upper East Side, near where Kelly lived. And, he wrote a book on Hegel and the political. And you had a group of people placed at certain universities, that did Hegel studies. To me, my interest in Hegel through the American lens is Mitchell Franklin. I don't know if you know Mitchell Franklin, but he was a philosopher of law and a professor of law. He knew Korsch, by the way. He was at Tulane University when Korsch was there in the 30s. Franklin taught one of my uncles in law school and then taught one of my cousins 30 years later. So it was a very long history with Mitchell Franklin. He wrote a great piece on alienation in the law. And this is one of the greatest Marxist philosophy of the law. I hope Peter Bratz's next semester, when he does left legalism. Mitchell Franklin was his name. Mitchell Franklin. He was an expert in Roman law and an expert in French law. And as you know, Marx was educated by Gans, the criminal lawyer and criminal thinker, right? Marx took very active courses with him and very influenced early on by Edward Gans. I'm sorry, his name was Edward Gans, right? And was a criminal lawyer and did criminal law, right? So Franklin is the real deal, and he was Hegelian, right? He did a very, very good piece on the law and alienation based on a Hegelian Marxist model. Du Bois is interesting, but Franklin to me is the real deal. He's the one who also spoke about the dialectics of the U.S. Constitution, the three constitutions, of course, the white man's, the founding fathers, and it's interpreted. I mean, he's not reductionistic, but, I'm being kind of reductionistic. And then the second one, of course, the 1865, the 13th Amendment, opens up the second constitution, and then the third constitution is the court of public opinion. It starts to happen in the 50s. So it's very, very interesting the way he does this, and he wrote this book from a Hegelian, methodological point of view the dialectics of the came in later too. But Franklin was certainly there, yeah. Yeah. No, he was really a steel trap mind. He ended up at Case Western Reserve as a philosopher. And he also was a great amateur photographer. I mean, professional, quote, hyphen amateur. Never made a living, but the quality was like Sean O'Mara here, you know? Yeah. But anyway, I had a very, very active thing. I mean, I met his wife once, and yeah. I mean, I would like to write my own thing, a kind of monograph, you know, in a way. He was a communist. He's a communist at Tulane University in the law school who taught Roman law and also taught Napoleonic Code. You know, because at Tulane you get the Napoleonic Code, it's Louisiana, right? The same in Montreal.
Does the Napoleonic Code come out of Roman law by any chance?
Yes, of course, yeah.
One thing that always puzzled me
Yeah.
is that most of the continental countries, I think their law comes out of Rome, but not England. Common law is not radically, but is sufficiently different, right? I know very little about the difference, but
Right.
ours comes out of England, right? Our law.
Yeah, I mean, we have a tremendous Anglo law, you know, yeah. But Roman law is very important. I mean, you know, in the framework, going back to that too. And that's something that Deleuze always remarked upon, which is good, that philosophy doesn't study law enough, right? There's no real philosophy of law. And that's been been a problem in a lot of ways. You know, the right is very good at manipulating the law. What the damage Trump has done in the 2.5 years, not just on stage, just think of the judges that have been appointed at these local levels. I mean, you know, what's going on? Just like the Reagan did. They went local. They blind you internationally by all their shenanigans, right? And then their rhetoric, but at the same time, they're filling all these local school boards and the local courts, right? With people that are favorable to them. And that's where the battle is in a certain way, one part of the battle.
Yeah, their domination of the Texas textbook.
And guess who's a part of that? Laura Bush.
Yeah.
Part of that industry. Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
Did
So,
you-
yeah, go ahead.
Did he try to write a philosophy of law with his famous work, L'Esprit des Lois?
Yeah. He wrote
He
the
was
spirit of
trying
the laws.
to-
Right. Yeah.
But you said there is no philosophy of law.
Well, no, today. So there are people that wrote, about the philosophy of law. Yeah, you get that in Cicero, you get that in the Romans, very actively, in the classical traditions, in a way. So anyway, that's where we're going. Any questions or any thoughts or anything you'd like to do, with all of this? I think the good thing will be the exposure to Hegel, I hope, in a different way, I hope so. I don't want to cloud it so much with these readings. I'm putting this up here because, it's secondary sources. It's good for explication and explanation. These are major thinkers, but at the same time, let's see what we can glean through our own reading, kind of suspend, if you will, phenomenologically, all the baggage, right, so to speak, that we impose and bring to the text. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, okay. And anyway, it's such a beautiful, beautiful text. Hippolyte says begin with the introduction. Other people say spend a year on the 72 propositions and the prefaces.
The introduction and what else?
Well, I'm going to go through this and make sure we get, the most salient stuff. I'll map it, in a way, but at the same time, we're not going to have time to read all of this. I'd be doing it a disservice. We can continue later, but I do want to read, on consciousness and self-consciousness, definitely, that section. I want to know what he means by science. I want to go through that in some way, where it's Wissenschaften, right? And then I want to go, there's a section called, in the spirit section, on the Enlightenment. That's why I want to begin with Kant. He does go back to reason and the Enlightenment with Kant. And for Josh's purposes, I want to engage the subject-object problem that Hegel addresses through Kant, in many ways. tries to solve, and the old phenomena nuema, problem as well. And also, why is an idealist, and what is the traps of idealism, or as Lenin used to say, to appeal to revolutionary authority. Lenin used to say, I'd rather talk to an intelligent idealist than a vulgar materialist, right? In a way. So he was very much taken by, and a book that Lenin didn't really study. He studied the logic. This was something that was going on. And anyway, so, well, why don't we go, I want to do really a close reading, if you will, of what is Enlightenment by Kant. I mean, first of all, maybe you could say what you thought of it, and then I'll give, kind of a reading of it, what I get from it. Go forward. This is 1784. It's a commissioned piece. It's philosophical journalism, in a way. It was really answering the question, what is Enlightenment? It was followed by Moses Mendelssohn, and most of you probably know that the Jewish question is beginning during this period. The Jewish question was the Jewish Haskalah, which was also happening with Mendelssohn, and Lessing wrote The Jew earlier, 30 years before this, in the 1750s and 60s, and this is the question of how does the Jewish Haskalah fit in with the movement of the Enlightenment, or with German philosophy.
What is that first word?
The Haskalah, yeah, it was called the Haskalah.
Is that a Hebrew word?
Yeah. How does it fit with German philosophy? So this was part of the background here too, of what does it mean to be in an enlightened age or an age of enlightenment as well. This is really the question. And this was later problematized, of course, by Franz Rosenzweig and also Hermann Cohn. And this is a very long history in Europe that we're, in the dark about here, very much of Hermann Cohn, who was the neo-Kantian and the teacher of Walter Benjamin, and then Franz Rosenzweig, who wrote the great book, The Star of Redemption, the star of saving the phenomena, saving So Rosenzweig and Cohn were two major players that came out of this debate. Most of you know Lessing, right? You know Lessing, Laocoon, the classical, he did work on aesthetics, on the sculpture, Laocoon, yeah? No? Anyway, Lessing was a major dramatist. He wrote Nathan the Wise, it was one of his great plays, right? All of which was part of the Jewish tradition during this period, right? Yeah. So, we can, keep that in mind too, going forward. And this is a long history that ends up in the Jewish question of Marx, revisited by Sartre, an anti-Semite and Jew, which was again reflections on the Jewish question. It was translated as anti-Semite and Jew. So this is, again, trying to situate the piece that he's doing here. This is not the critique of pure reason. The first volume appears, the first critique of pure reason appears 1787, 3 years after this. This also precedes by 5 years the French Revolution, right? And like I said, he's reading Rousseau very actively here, including Emile, the text on pedagogy, the central text of pedagogy. Okay, so, he begins, and this is a minor text, but I think it's crucial to our thinking, right? So, first of all, I want to work with the notion of the present. So, the present in which Kant is working, and I think this is implicit throughout the What is Enlightenment, is a world that's turning backwards, one part of it. The other part of the present is the herald of a forthcoming event, in the Badiouian and Heideggerian sense of the ariseness of the emergence. For Badiou, it's the French Revolution. 1789 is the first event of modernity. For Heidegger, it's the reemergence of the question of being, right? And so anyway, the herald of an event. And then the third part is the point of transition to the dawning of a new world. And this should influence us. Right? Are we on the verge of a dawn, right, in terms of where we are? This question of the Enlightenment haunts philosophy, the Frankfurt School, the dialectic of enlightenment, right? Most of the Marxist tradition, what does it mean to be enlightened, in many ways. incredible, we're still discussing this. Yeah? Enlightenment is emancipation, enlightenment as, something that goes on in Hollywood, right? How does Hollywood use the a priori of Kant to make films? How does this basically go way beyond our experience? Joker is probably going to be a good example. I haven't seen it, but I know people would see. I know nobody. Yeah, he probably will go, but I'll go because I'm interested in Hollywood masters the a priori, the pre-experiential, right? And then floods you, right? In a sense, and this is what it's really good at, in terms of camera work, etc. I saw the Lossy, Mr. Klein, by the way. It's a magnificent film. I recommend it. Alain Delon, Jean Moreau, and Juliette Berthaud are phenomenal in
I
this.
didn't get the
film.
title.
Mr. Klein, Monsieur Klein.
Klein?
It's in French, yes.
Where is it now?
It's
Is
at
that-
the film forum.
It's worth
Probably another week or two.
Till Thursday.
More than worth seeing. Have you seen it?
No, but I'm going Thursday.
Good. Please go.
Thursday.
Yeah.
Is it French, Monsieur Klein?
Yes.
Oh,
Robert Klein. Yeah.
I'll
Is
go
the
see
man.
it.
Yeah. It's a great study in the double
I
and the
couldn't find a
double.
review, I didn't know what it was about.
Well, it's about a lot of things, but yes, it's one beautiful sequence of the International, by the way, which is very beautiful. Lossy never came back. Joseph Lossy had to leave because of McCarthyism, but he never named names, and he went to Europe and he stayed. He stayed in England, and then people approached him about making films. A lot of people that ratted out or were part of the collusion with the government during that period. And unlike Dalton Trumbo, who wrote, kind of Kumbaya, we were all victims, right? Both those who ratted and those who didn't. Lossy said, no way, I'm not making films with any of these people. So Alain Delon produced this film. It's interesting.
Who?
Alain Delon, the actor. He produced this film. Yeah, a great French actor. It's very interesting. And Lossy also did The Servant. I don't know if you know Joseph Lossy's work. Dirk Burgard is another great filmmaker, in my opinion, completely forgotten in cinema history and never really put out there. Yeah. And the period piece, you're going to be really impressed because of the way the sets are, and especially the way he captures faces of women, this kind of decadence on top of, the struggle that's going on with the Gestapo. This is the night before many people were in 42. There was a huge roundup of the Jews. So this was really on that eve. And Mr. Klein is an art dealer who rips off Jews who have to sell for cash, right? It's very interesting what it's about. Yeah.
Isabella of Spain did that too, didn't she?
Well, yeah. This is
Another
Mr.
story,
Klein
right?
in 42 in Vichy. Yeah. 42 in Vichy was different than Spain.
Was that when Walter Benjamin fled? Or?
He fled 2 years before that and then committed suicide at the border,
Right.
in the Pyrenees.
Right.
Or at least that's the official story. That he took enough morphine to kill 4 horses. It was one of the reported stuff. And he left all his papers with George Bataille. Which is interesting. So anyway, I want to talk about the present, right? in a sense that this is timely 220 something years later, right? 230 years, 235 to be exact years later. That, is the present, are we turning backwards? Are we in this regressive moment of history? And that Kant is talking about that then, and are we talking about that now? The present as history, right? I know Zizek,
Zizek kind of talked about
the nostalgia for the present, he used that term from Jameson, which is in the cultural logic of late capitalism, Okay, so, and then as a herald of a forthcoming event, are we on the verge of something? Are we emerging, are we seeing the signs of something? Is there something really emerging here, right, in a way? Is there a revolutionary upsurge? Is there an insurrectionary upsurge? Is there going to be, this kind of continual, fight against the system now? Is the youth. I talked to my niece, 19, 20, she's in Hunter's Honors. They're ready to fight. And they're smart. She's reading Horkheimer this semester already, 19. Yeah. What were you going to say?
No, Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so, I don't know. I
Yeah.
wish it's, yeah.
Well, there's definitely a lot more people interested.
Yeah, that's a hunger. That's another thing we can talk about. Okay, and then the point of transition, are we on the verge of a mutation? Are we on the verge of something really radically different? So this is what Kant is really talking about in terms of the, thing. So let's go through this. I think it's very important. Anything really strike you here? I mean, this to me is a very interesting piece in terms of its shortness, but its breadth and its layeredness. Yeah? Anything that struck you or, yeah?
Well,
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
to a certain extent, other people have used some of the same ideas in their works.
Yeah,
But the idea of we're not able to, we're either too lazy, we don't have the courage to
right.
act upon what
Right.
our understanding. We'd rather have somebody direct us and so forth. What I really found interesting is the idea between the private and the public.
Yes. No, that's interesting the way he did this, right?
I have a translation which doesn't say self-imposed immaturity, it says self-imposed tutelage.
Right, well, it's the same thing, but maturity and immaturity are a better translation in a way.
Which is better?
Well, I mean,
Immaturity.
directly, literally from the German, tutelage is what was used for many years, right? You're under someone's tutelage. But he's really talking about the immaturity here that works, and then he defines it, and what Sean just pointed out, it's the inability to use one's understanding without the guidance of another. Number one, this dependence on everything. The cult of the expert. The professor will do it for you. The boss who makes the decisions. Wait for the leaders to take control. Reform electoral politics. All these kind of things fit into this immaturity in my opinion. This immaturity is self-imposed when its cause is not a lack of self-understanding, but in lack of resolve and courage to use your understanding without guidance from another. And then he goes through a motto. Have the courage or always be bold. Dare to be bold, right? Dare to be audacious and use your understanding. And this becomes the signal of the Enlightenment, the motto, right? Dare to be bold, right? Dare to be bold. So then he goes on, right? And we're going to get to the private and public. I'm going to just hold that for a minute. So what happens to most people? They become lazy and cowardly, right? And nature has released them from alien guidance. Nonetheless, they remain in lifelong immaturity. These people stay, and that's most of the population. This is what Reich does in the mass psychology of fascism. This is what we get in the psychological structure of fascism. And also the dependence upon the cult of the expert.
Makes me think of Freud, psychic infantilism. One
Yes,
of my favorite phrases.
infantilization is prevalent everywhere, constantly. I even get this about the keys here from the woman that is part of the CCD. Karen, she tells me, make sure you close the door, make sure you leave the room where it is. I mean, this is like you're talking to an infinite. Like I don't know this about the school and its practice. Yeah, in a sense. But anyway, that's what's coming down. That's what's coming down constantly. So it's so easy to be immature. Very easy to be immature. And I see this at LIU. If I have a book to serve, and then it gives 3 reasons, right? The book for my understanding, right? Right? We have the conscience from the priest, and we have the diet from the doctor. Everything is prescribed, right? Right? Basically, that's what we're looking for. Always for the prescription, right? In a sense. So he says, I do not exert myself at all. I can just look it up, what to take, what vitamin supplements I need, etc., etc. Not to use your own understanding of your own body and to try to figure it out. I need not think if I can pay. That's part of our culture, right? Yeah. This kind of paying the professional class, paying the cult of the expert. This is what neoliberalism is excellent about, The pain to the cult of the expert on everything, right? The lawyer, the lawyerly culture, you know, that we're always constantly paying this, you know, to go into the lawyers. I mean, these are symptoms to me, at least, you know, what's going on. Others will undertake the irksome work for me, right? Instead of me doing it myself. So, again, the responsibility, right? In a way. And what relationship, responsibility, and freedom have. You know, this dialectical, reciprocal relationship between freedom and responsibility.
Escape from Freedom is a great book by
Eric Fromm.
yeah.
Yeah.
The same thing, idea, right?
Escape from freedom. His escape from his wife. Freedom from Reichman. Right? Monster psychoanalyst, right? Anyway. Okay, so this is interesting to me, again, and we'll go back to this private public because it's very important, and I think it's
He's misogynistic though, isn't he? He
Who
said
is?
the entire fair sex is given to this, according to the next sentence,
yeah.
because he,
This is 1784.
yeah.
Right? I mean, yes, right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
in some ways, the turn to Trump is a rejection of the whole expert narrative.
Well, I mean, the liberal class is excellent at presenting what Kant does. They are your guardians.
Yeah.
Hillary Clinton is going to do it for you, right?
Yeah.
Just leave it to the great lawyers, leave it to the spin doctors, leave it to this. This is what they've been good at. And you're right in a sense that the cult of the expert and this kind of thing of, you know, the guardians are being, you know, taken apart. But what comes up against the guardians, if you don't have an enlightened public and people that can see this, is an authoritarian personality. You know, right?
Exactly what we got.
Right? This is what happens, right? In a sense. So one is feeding the other. One is setting up the other in terms of the reaction. And believe me, he's going to do this. The cult of the expert is going to be embodied by Elizabeth Warren. When you really want to start talking about what's going to come down. Yeah, it's already happened. And he's going to go after her. You know, it's not only going to be Pocahontas. It's going to be about her expertise, right? The schoolmarmness, right? She doesn't know how things work. You know, he's going to go at all these levels. Yeah. So this is important because Kant, in a way, is a thinker of our times in so many ways. You know, Kant really wanted the cosmopolitanism. You know, he's really the great thinker of, quote, the United Nations, if you will, or the League of Nations, right? In a sense, he really believed that Enlightenment could lead us to this kind of a practice. So anyway, let's go on. So that benevolently taking over the supervision regard the step to maturity is very dangerous, not to mention difficult. I mean, I experienced this in my union. You know, I'm the mature voice in the room. I'm the one with the knowledge, etc. But by bringing that up, I'm dangerous, right? And I'm taking away from the, you know, quote unquote leadership, right? Or those who want power, right? So, you know, because I'm willing to take on the difficulty. So the other thing, first making the domestic livestock dumb, they make the union people dumb, right? And having carefully made sure that these docile creatures, and you see Foucault here, the docility. The docile creatures will not take, you know, docile bodies. I don't know if you've read Discipline and Punish, but there's a whole section on the docility of the body, right? And he's getting this from Kant and Bentham, right? Will not take a simple step without the go-kart to which they are harnessed, right? Very interesting. You need to be on a leash. Collar. This is really what's going on. These guardians then show them the danger that threatens them should they attempt to walk alone. You don't want to do this. You know, don't take that risk. You know, you're going to fall. You know, be scared. So right here you have the elements, I think, for the security principle. Don't dare to take a risk. Right? You're going to be going into the realm of insecurity. You're going into the realm of something that is not, you know, not going to do you any good. Now this danger is actually not so great, for after falling a few times, he puts this in, they would in the end certainly learn to walk. But an example of this kind makes men timid and usually frightens them out of other further attempts. We tried that with the revolution. We tried that back in the day, right, etc. Why try again? You know, we're defeated, you know, etc. You know how defeatism takes place, right, in a sense. Yeah. Right? So, is enlightenment, right, in a sense, the release, right? Is it a way out? That's the first question that I think Kant is posing. Is it an exit from immaturity? Right? Is that what enlightenment really does? Does it emerge from us? Yeah. Okay? So it's difficult to work himself out of the immaturity that has all become but his nature. You know, so we have everybody's human nature. Today, right? Completely conditioned. Right? And this is, you know, in some ways you can see where Heidegger gets a lot of this thing about the thing and the conditioning of the thing, right? In a way. How do you undo this conditioning where people are? Lukács on second nature. Right? Yeah. Marx himself on nature, right? History of nature. So he has become fond of this state and the time being incapable of using his own understanding. People can't think. You can't think. I mean, if you really think about where we are, this is a complete insane asylum that we're living through right now. It's not only a war that they've succeeded against the poor, the lower middle class, now the war on the middle class, right, etc. What's going on? Yeah, very, very much so, right? So, we're asleep, right? No one allowed him to ever attempt it. So that's the question. You're not really allowed the autonomy, you know, which is a principle of the Enlightenment, and we'll get back to this with Hegel too. But this is a crucial word that people like Kant don't like, right? But this becomes a crucial word in the Enlightenment. The search for one's autonomy. That the goal of education is to bring the students to some kind of autonomy. This was the goal of Enlightenment education. And we'll go back to this too. Autonomos, right? The ability to self-name oneself. The ability to build own self-conventions, self-ways of behaving. Okay? So, rules, formulas, mechanical aids, everybody, again, I mean, I hate to use these, I mean, I'm going to do it because it's on my mind. Examples in the Union, everything is literalism in the contract. No interpretation, just rules and formulas. No thinking about that. How do you get around this? How do you think this through? How do you interpret this? What context was this written in? None of these questions are really asked. Right? It's just the literal, you know, what the sentence says is what it is.
Is the CUNY contract out yet?
No, not yet. No, not for CUNY yet. Yeah. Okay? So, only a few succeeded cultivating their own minds and freeing themselves and pursuing the secure course. So it's for the happy few that Nietzsche, you know, speaks of later, you know, in his own thing, because Nietzsche is very influenced by this, as is, you know, if you want to read, you know, a kind of reinforcement of this at a more sophisticated level, read Nietzsche on the future of our educational institutions, and particularly the book Schopenhauer's Educated. A brilliant, brilliant book, Schopenhauer's Educated.
Stendhal used that phrase too, the happy few.
Yes, he did.
Stendhal.
One of Nietzsche's favorite authors, called him the most brilliant psychologist of the early 19th century.
Le Rouge et le Noir.
Yes,
I can't
right.
remember
Red
anything
and the
about
Black.
it. Oh, of course. in that.
Charterhouse of Parma, yeah, as well. Charterhouse of Parma and the Spider Stratagem is based on
Chateaux de Parme was another.
Julian Sorel. Charterhouse of Parma, yeah, the one set in Italy, yeah. Two films made, both on his.
He's very subtle.
Yes, great, yeah. He wrote on love, one of the great treatises on love. He had nothing but failings in love, but he understood it very well. Like Ingmar Bergman, who was a wreck, wrote a book called Strindberg, who was a wreck, wrote a book called Getting Married, about all his failed marriages. Right? But brilliant.
He was a rabid Italophile.
Yes, that's right. Okay. All right. So anyway, but the public should enlighten itself is more likely. So you see the switch here from the individual, right, to the collective. right? Already you begin to see this movement from psychic individuation to collective individuation in the Enlightenment. I'm using, kind of more contemporary terms here, obviously, right? Only if it is allowed freedom, enlightenment is almost inevitable. For even among the entrenched guardians of the great masses, a few will always think for themselves. A few, having thrown off the yoke of immaturity, will spread the spirit of a rational appreciation for their own worth and for each person's calling to think for himself. But it should be particularly noted that if a public that was first placed in this yoke by the guardians is suitably aroused by some of those who are altogether incapable of enlightenment, it may force the guardians themselves to remain under the yoke. You can hear the DNC and you can hear, the Trump supporters right here, right? So pernicious it is to instill prejudices, for they finally take revenge upon their originators or on their descendants. Thus the collective public can only attain enlightenment slowly. This is gradualism at work. You begin to see this play out. Evolutionary socialism and Bernstein. I'm projecting, look, I do this, trying to, say that this has a very large screened background, projected background, what's going on. Perhaps a revolution, and this is very interesting. This part to me is one of the more interesting parts. Perhaps a revolution can overthrow autocratic despotism and profiteering or power-grabbing oppression, but it can never really truly reform a manner of thinking. Instead, new prejudices, just like the old ones they replace, will serve as a leash for the great unthinking mass. And also maybe what happened too in many of the socialist revolutions too. Yeah? In some ways, right? Yeah? Yeah? You have to have a revolution in thinking alongside, what he's really saying, alongside the political economic. Right? He's really saying this. And this again is, I think, Kant at his best. Right? And something that we need to take seriously without thinking a revolution, right? Without the revolution in thinking, where are we, in a sense? Are we just, capitalism makes you sick, socialism will make you well, right? Right? Yeah, not really. Just one manages the disease better than the other. Without thinking, we really need to, take this seriously. Okay, so nothing is required for this, and remember the French Revolution, what happens? 1789, Robespierre, Saint-Just, Danton, etc., Camille Desmoulins, among others, Hébert, all take power, right? In a sense, they create the Committee for Public Safety, they start feeding the people, there's a revolution, but by 1794, everybody's at the guillotine. Right? 5 years into the revolution, right? In a sense. And we're going to see this in Hegel because the section on reason is really Robespierre speaking. Yeah? Hegel's section on reason, the transition to reason. And I should frame this too. You have those who pick up, and going back to Hegel just for a second, since I mentioned that, you have those who take up the master-slave dialectic, if you will, or the lordship and bondage section very actively, like Kojève. But then there are those who take up the section on reason, who are Lukács and Marcuse and Adorno, right? They don't really focus on the master-slave dialectic. So this is interesting too, we'll talk more about this too. And also, I forgot to mention the Forrest Johnson tendency in Detroit with C.L.R. James and Raya Darshik, Carl with Boggs and Jimmy Boggs and what's her name, Grace Boggs. They also, Grace Boggs, who were all part of this Hegelian moment too, right? In the 50s, especially with the Forrest Johnson tendency. Is she still alive or did she die? She's 100 years old almost.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know she was active, very active.
Yeah, she died recently.
Yeah. So, nothing is required for the Enlightenment, however, except freedom. And the freedom in question is the least harmful of all, namely the freedom to use reason publicly in all matters. So what is freedom, right? The ability to use reason publicly, the public sphere, public reason, the collective in a sense. So then he goes through these three levels, these levels of obedience, right? Because again, Kant is really going to question authority here, and the authoritarian, but especially authority. So he goes through the obedience, right? The tax collector, right? The taxman, right? The military, right? And of course the priestly class, right? And this is thing. But if you look further down, as a scholar, he can make comments about errors in military service, the citizen. The same thing, right? The complete freedom of the priest. Even the calling to impart to the public all of his carefully considered and well-intentioned thoughts concerning mistaken aspects of that symbol, as well as the suggestions for the better arrangement of religious and church matters at the bottom of the page. So he's talking about this freedom versus the freedom of the public space to use reason, but in the private space, you're not really being able to use reason. There's an obedience always going on, right? So he has this distinction, and what do we learn from this? I think what we learn from this is how privatization works. You know, how this term privatization actually works. What privatization does is it destroys the public sphere of argument, you know, the ability to use freedom, etc. This is really something that we've witnessed for the last 40 years, right? An inability to gather, the inability to have the public sphere for debate, etc., etc. We have a stage by the media tonight, as we talk, you know, we're going to have a democratic
self-encapsulation with smartphones,
right.
in my humble estimation, is the biggest single in our culture destroyer of this kind of
Yes, of course.
freedom.
That's why I said we could ask the question, are we pre-Enlightenment? I mean, really the question here about German idealism and philosophy is ultimately, you know, are we in a position now where we're going to become, you know, in some ways the happy few, right? Is this what we're going to have to do? Except in a lot of ways, and are we really dealing with a kind of new nominalism, which is brought to you by Alphabet, Google, the new linguistic capital, is the linguistic capital of technology. How does this work? You know, in Bernard Stiegler's terms, the hypomnemic, you know, universe of everything is in the machines. There's no longer anything here. The inability to recollect, to make connections. You see this in the classrooms. The inability to make interconnections, to make references. Yes, no, he's great at this.
That was great.
Very, very smart at this, and he's very Kantian, and more Kantian than Hegelian. So we'll you know, talk about this. Bernard Stiegler. Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. He's you know, he has the Heideggerian, Kantian, these kind of moments, you know. I mean, look, the Kantian moment, and I know I talked about this when we did structuralism, post-structuralism times, and we brought up the question of the postmodernism. The return to Kant in France was a major move away from Marx. It was a major move. Jean-Luc Nancy, you know, all these people. Even though Marx was always part of the tradition, Lyotard and others, they made this shift to go back to Kant to pieces like this and rethink it, you know, in some ways, where we are. So anyway, let me go on. You know, the church, he goes through these things, but really the big distinction here is between the private and the public, right? And Sean, you want to speak to that? I mean,
I wasn't quite sure what he was trying to say. I guess in the private, you sort of, the position you're in, you have to carry through whatever the instruction, the system doesn't allow you to.
The obedience is always at work in the private sphere, according to him.
So in the public, at least, you're in the public, it's different. I guess you can sort of.
Well, you have the freedom in the public sphere through reason, public reason. Okay, through public reason, you have the freedom to argue publicly and argue with freedom. You don't have really any freedom in the private sphere. So I guess the claim I'm trying to make, or at least the hypothesis, is that this moment of privatization that has occurred during the last 40, 45 years, is really an attempt to steal freedom, right, from the public sphere. We don't really have freedom. We have reactions, we have comments, we have opinions, but do we really have that public sphere where we can debate, where we can actually use our minds freely? It's very difficult. I mean, we have things like this, that's true. We can go here as Zizek, or we can go here, at the Valley Bar, where it was good last night on a friend of mine's book, on secularization. But, we have that kind of freedom and that kind of opening in the public sphere, but is that really part and parcel of the culture? That's become institutionalized. It's become, very much marginalized. So he's speaking about how does one, emerge into this mature universe. What he's really talking about here to me is that the guardian class is really an enemy class in a certain way. The guardians, right?
It's the ownership class, right? I mean,
Well, he's not saying that. He's not saying that.
He's
It
not
could
saying
be
that.
the guardians are representatives of the ownership class in some ways, yes. Yeah. And what does that mean, the ownership class? Because a lot of people own stuff, but they're having a hard time, making ends meet. That's another thing too. We have to rethink class as a certain thing. What does class really mean as a movement, rather than the fixation that it's ruling class with money, ownership of the means and forces of production? Yes and no.
Class is always left out of our discourse in this
Yes,
country.
I know.
And that's why it bothers me when people make fun of Bernie Sanders. He may be, emotional and talk with his hand a lot, but he's bringing us back to, basic notions of class. We don't talk about it. You sweep it under the rug.
Right,
It helps the capitalist class,
right.
the ownership class, when you don't discuss class.
Right, but the thing is that we're really speaking to go back to this, is that private reason, in a way, is domestication, right, and obedience. It's like being part of the livestock, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's really that much. And that the only place where freedom can occur is in the public sphere, in the public realm, right? Anyway. So there's a collectivity at work here. There's a destruction of the individual here, which is interesting, I think. Yeah. Do you want to?
I just had the
Yeah,
opposite
sure.
impression when reading it, but I
Go
like
ahead,
your
tell
version
me,
better actually.
Tell me your impression. It's okay. I'm
No, I mean I just saw.
nothing sacred about my reading.
No, I liked yours better.
Well.
But it just it seemed to me that everything was predicated on this notion of the individual ultimately, that there were all these sort of moral judgments that he was passing, to sort of make apology or sort of placate any kind of criticism that he would get from the ruling class or this sort of emerging ruling class of the bourgeoisie,
Right.
basically.
On one level, I think you're absolutely correct, because it ends up as a kind of plea for, if you will, for Frederick, who's the sponsor, right, in a way, and it's a kind of plea for benevolent despotism, given the situation he's in.
Right.
At the same time, I think he's trying to going well past the atomistic or the individual here, and try to think of this public reason as a collective project, right?
Yeah.
In a way, and that's why he poses the question, do we live in an age of enlightenment, or do we live in an enlightened age?
Yeah.
And he's trying to talk about that, because one, he's saying that we live in an age of enlightenment, and it must be gradual, right, in this public moment. And at the same time, which is a revolutionary statement in some ways, because we're not yet in the enlightened age. He's not saying that there is a vanguard yet.
Is he taking a swipe at Frederick in that last, when he says, argue as much as you want about what you want, but obey? Is he referring to an enlightened despot, I think?
Yes. Yes.
Even though he was sponsored, was he?
Yes, he was sponsored, yeah.
But
Yeah.
he takes a swipe at him, right?
Yes.
Voltaire had a fallout with him too, right?
With,
Voltaire had a
Frederick.
fallout with Frederick. the Great.
Yes, he did. Yeah, Voltaire did too. Yeah. Absolutely. And remember, Bismarck was the first socialist in a way, take care of the people, take care of the public in a certain way. Public health.
Pension, for the,
And
for
Benjamin.
the army mainly, for veterans, right, I
exactly,
think.
yeah,
But
exactly.
at least he started it.
Yes, he did, that's what I'm saying, yeah, in a way. I mean, this is 225 years ago, and this is radical for today. I mean, think about this in the context that we're reading. That's why I want to look at the present, again, in terms of the framing or the, heralding a new event, right? The present is a world that's turning backwards. To read this at multiple levels, right? We have the regression, is that you I think you speak to very well in terms of this individual, domestication that's going on, the use of private, and privatization, private reason, how reason as private, which is really what's been going on in this country. You have nothing but privatization. The whole real estate industry is privatization. Look what's going on with the de Blasio thing. The sham and the disgrace of public housing that he was going to make affordable housing. The way he used that code to get elected, and how many young people went along with this nonsense, right? To think about it, to think about it this way, and how privatization is working here, because there was never really a public space to use freedom to argue, effectively. So what do we get? We get critique. On the outside, we read, very good studies, assassination in New York, gentrification, all kinds of articles about the transformations going on, but it's not in the public sphere, because it's not, again, the collective that is really doing this. This is what he's really gunning for here. Yeah?
I get that now, yeah.
I think, in a way.
Yeah.
And even if you have
Yeah, sure.
so many kinds of jobs because of the way social media functions, like your freedom of speech as a so-called private citizen is so restricted in that
Yes,
sphere
right.
because your
That's a
employers
good point.
insist on monitoring it constantly.
Right. And also, are you really free in that public space called social media?
Right.
I mean, everybody's going to take it the wrong way,
Yeah.
it's really, they're going to take it up the wrong way,
Yeah.
right, in a sense. Versus that of the old letter writing, if you really think about this, people were very careful in how they constructed, sentences, etc. The whole Twitter, soundbite,
Right. like
culture,
immediacy.
Facebook is a constant, right, barrage.
Yeah.
There must be good instruction in the school. Did you notice that?
I noticed it was on the wall, yeah.
It's good.
Yeah.
I mean, what we're discussing, that's what that is, basically.
Well, we are. That's where it was. This is 1784. Remember, it's 8 years after the American Revolution, 5 years before the French Revolution. It's after the Declaration of Independence, right? In a sense. And this word autonomy had a real resonation. Nobody talks about autonomy anymore.
About what?
Autonomy, being autonomous, right? Being autonomous.
You're eccentric if you're autonomous.
Well, some
In this
people-
culture,
yeah.
you're a kook.
You're out of center.
You have to be a conformist.
So anyway, I think let's just go to number 7, which is on page 4. If it is now asked, do we presently live in an enlightened age? The answer is no. Right? No. And we're still saying this today. Right? But we do live in an age of enlightenment. As matters now stand, a great deal is still lacking in order for men as a whole to be, or even put themselves in a position to be able, without external guidance, to apply understanding confidently to religious issues. And remember, this is also, Kant's, bone too, religion within the limits of reason. This is the Enlightenment. This is the dialectic between faith and knowledge, right? And which knowledge we don't have. But we do have a clear indications that the way is now being opened for men to proceed freely in this direction. And see, this is why he praises Frederick, because there's religious toleration and opening during this era, for that, And that the obstacles to general enlightenment, to their release from their self-imposed immaturity, are gradually diminishing. In this regard, this age is the age of enlightenment, the century of Frederick. But a prince who does not find it beneath him that he takes it to be his duty to prescribe nothing, but rather to allow men complete freedom in religious matter, who thereby renounces the arrogant title of tolerance, is himself enlightened and deserves to be praised by the grateful present and by posterity as the first, at least where the government is concerned, to release the human race from immaturity.
He did do that, right?
Yes, yes. There was a religious tolerance that was created, yes.
The Protestant
Read it in the
culture.
context as well. I mean, I want us to do both, right? What relevance for us here in the present? What can we really take from this? And at the same time, to what is he responding in his imminent historical condition, right? In a way. For example, a lot of people read Lacan, just conceptually or theoretically, right? But he's responding, he's an argument. He's an argument with Marie Bonaparte and the entire French Psychoanalytic Society when he starts his seminars in 1951. And most people don't know the issues about the ego. Why does he start with the ego and the techniques and Freud, as part of his, after the discourse on Rome?
Yeah, but always very cattily and angrily responding to
Yes,
people.
exactly, yeah. So anyway, so this is again, right, that the existence of freedom, he's really talking about, in a way, the freedom to think, right? The freedom to think without censor, etc. And really what I think Mia was pointing out about the social media and all this, is it acts as a censor, right? It really acts as a censor on thought, because it doesn't require thought. So it's censoring, the machine is censoring before it really even
The scary
occurs.
thing is it requires a certain kind of thought often, a very calculating thought of always self-censorship,
Right,
to figure out how you can play. I don't have a job like this, but I have friends that do, and they're constantly thinking about it. But it's just thinking about how to, be acceptable within this, structure.
right.
I mean, I agree.
Yeah,
I agree.
yeah, listen,
With everything he says, it just seems like that he's also prescribing a certain way of thinking too. The freedom to think is also confined very specifically to sort of the Cartesian idea or XYZ. You can kind of go through the whole list of Western philosophy in a way, right? But it seems like I agree with his Enlightenment position ultimately, but it's also foreclosing some other possibility, right? I guess that's the argument always against Kant, seems to me.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, privileging the mathematical, in other works, Kant essentially, the mathematical position, that's the Heideggerian critique of Kant, for instance, right?
The axioms of intuition.
Right, forecloses the possibility
Euclidean background.
of
yes.
other previous forms of thinking, ultimately.
Right.
I mean, I don't know. That just seems to me also sort of underlying all of it as well.
Right. Yeah, okay, well, I mean, I kind of, framed it in such a way that, is obviously trying to make it, let's take this too. So, who's responsible? We're responsible.
Yeah.
For the change within, going back to what you say about the individual, right?
Mm-hmm.
Enlightenment is, first of all, the revolution begins at home.
Mm-hmm.
The shedding of all these things, right? I mean, he's got that in terms of the responsibility. So the change from within takes care of the immature status. The motto is the instruction, right?
Mm-hmm.
Always be bold, take risks, right? That's the motto. And have the courage to know, right? And the ability to dare to be bold with that knowledge, right? Collectively, but as also the act of courage. To go back to this notion of public reason is to act collectively. That's a courage, right? The social, etc. And the elements, right? And agents, right? So you have both the elements in the individual, but also then the agency, which is collective.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if you want to think of it that way.
Yeah, I like it, yeah.
The individual and then the kind of, disindividuation, if you will, as you make the move to, the agency of a process, right? In a process. So he's looking again at, in some ways, this Enlightenment as revolutionary absurdity. even though he doesn't use that language, he's
Right.
thinking this through.
Yeah.
As Hegel once said, Hegel said, the French Revolution was Kant's second critique put into practice. The second critique, the critique of practical reason put into practice. He said that's what the French Revolution was. And that's who Robespierre was, in terms of reason and revolution during that period. Right? Okay? So then, then the question is, do you imagine the Enlightenment as a political and social revolution that affects all of mankind? But does it really, in another way, and think between the lines here, is he also speaking to the change that goes on in the human being, right? Is he really talking about nature here too, right? Even though he doesn't mention it explicitly, is one of the things, not only the effect of historical, political and economic change, right, as a revolution, but is he also talking about what makes a human being human, right? The nature of the human being. Is that also a stake here, right? Because what is the juxtaposition, to go back to that term, between the animals, the livestock, and then becoming human, right? In a way, the animal world, etc. So, what is this going to be? A change that affects, right? You have the effects of the revolution, but at the same time, the affect, if you will, of the change of humanness or human being.
What is that?
That's the thought police.
That's the set.
We don't need no education. That's Pink Floyd at work here. Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is that's not indicating you have to leave the building?
No, we're okay for another 25, 30 minutes at least. Right. So anyway, okay, so how can we escape, if you will, immaturity, right? Because this is the exit strategy, right? What is our way out? And we don't really think about ways out. We think about ways in too much, right? We don't really think about ways out. Lines of flight in Duluth, right? A very interesting concept. So 2 essential conditions that you can escape. One essential is the realm of obedience. No longer are you required to obey. You wanted to say something, John?
No.
Okay. And the other one, right, is the use of reason, which Sean brought up in the public realm, which has no other reason than reason itself. The reasoning for reasoning's sake. Right? How do we ultimately become expert at reason, which is the highest level of the Enlightenment, right, in a sense. The knowledge of how to reason, reason versus faith, in some ways. Knowledge versus
The
faith.
goddess reason was the main figure of the religion, the civic religion of the revolution, right?
Rousseau's civic religion, yes, right.
Are you familiar with Castex and Surveillance?
Yes, of course.
Well, the 18th century, the frontispiece shows the goddess
Yes.
and reason.
Of course.
It's a very,
Right.
for me anyway, it's a very
Right, of
meaningful,
course.
very
Yes.
nice.
Of course. So then the question is, where's reason? Sean brings up a good question in the beginning. This public reason, where is reason in all of this? Reason is reasoning for reason's sake. This is Kant at work. This is why he writes and does the architectonic of pure reason, right? To speak about this in the light of, that experience is not enough, right? Something behind this, right? Always. No? Yeah. So this is very dense in some ways. In another way. Yeah. Okay. So it becomes free, right? In its public use, reason, but it's submissive in its private use. Okay? Reason in the private sphere is very submissive. That's where the obedience, the realm of obedience, takes place. The pastor has to, go ahead, please.
I think it's very clear it was written pre-revolution, right? It still has this sort of optimism about reconciliation to the state, that reason isn't going to exceed itself.
Right.
I feel like he would change his mind. I don't know about Kant's reaction to the revolution very much, but
Well, he was very happy about the French Revolution.
yeah.
But I mean, I'm not so sure he was so happy like Hegel was with the Napoleonic moment. You know,
Right, sure.
for Hegel, the image was the world spirit on a horseback was Napoleon coming into Vienna.
I mean, I don't know if he's kind of like
Yeah.
editing himself
Yeah.
for, you know, the context, or if he really does believe that, like, just obeying, but, you know, publicly speaking about things is gonna be, like, feasible.
Well, I think in the obedience, in the realm of obedience, there's still a submissiveness within private reason. This is what he, again, he's trying to do, is move us to a kind of collective public sphere in which reason is exchanged. Your freedom is really to use your reason for reasoning's sake, you know, to give reasons. You know, I know French people who are educated, where in their households they have to give reasons for everything they do. I mean, that was part of an earlier generation, you know, it's now maybe 50, 55, right? I don't think it's going on today where the kids are subjected to reason because they're gonna throw the phone at the family or, you know, say, I'm FaceTiming with someone, you know, or I'm Snapshotting or
The
Snapchatting.
Cartesian spirit, right, with the French, I think.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's part of the Cartesian reasoning of the French, yeah, in a way, and also what reason became was the goddess. Really, the new goddess was really reason. This is Robespierre this is why Hegel says, this becomes, in a way, you know, the French Revolution in the figure of Robespierre. Yeah. And then look at, you know, I know you like Zizek, when he wrote that little thing, I think, on Robespierre, you know, for Verso's series, right? In introducing Robespierre, you know, and he'll maybe speak to this in some ways. You know, Zizek's interesting on this kind of stuff. He says, you know, the people, the born again and the religious crowd really believes faith is knowledge. There's no separation. Faith and belief is knowledge, right? They collapse, the two. And that's how the new right, the fundamentalists, really think, right? They're completely unenlightened, right? And the obedience is because of faith, right? Private reason, faith, you know, belief systems, right? That obey, right? This is what happens because there's no reason out there, right? There's no enlightenment. There's no ability to see knowledge as separate. This is America at work. Yeah, this is America at work. It's nothing but a mass of opinions. It's a melting pot. Instead of a melting pot of cultures, it'd probably be better to describe it as a melting pot of opinions. Yeah, it's never really well argued or well think. Look at what everybody's getting away with today. There's no I mean, when you really think about the premises of arguments or the premises of some of this stuff that's going on, yeah, think about the contradictions that are operative in this whole this move with Syria and against the Kurds now, and the fusion with the Turks, and what's happening, you know, yeah, internationally. Yeah, there's no reason at all going on, right? But how does the public accept this if they're not slaves or lazy or cowardly, right, etc.? This is lazy.
The public
and needs a
itself
government.
does not think, and therefore, whatever policies, there's a lot of chaos in a way in our culture. Chaos.
Well, yes, of course, but I mean, chaos has always been there since the Greeks, right? So the question is for Kant, and I think this is the radical question he's really asking, what makes him radical in this view, is what is the moment in which humanity, or mankind, whatever you use that word, would put its reason to use without subjecting it to any authority? This is what he's really trying to get around, where reason itself can, you know, be put to use without any authority. So there's a kind of anarchy here, right, as well. You know, very much like Marx when he says we will no longer have a need for government. We can govern ourselves, you know, the fish in the morning, hunt in the afternoon, poetize through the evening. So that is part of maybe his utopic speculation in some ways, right? And now, right, critique is necessary to get there, right? So this word critique, which means to separate out, where he goes, the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, And then the critique of judgment, Kant is really the thinker of critical philosophy. This is kind of the background to the Hegelian, moment. How does critical philosophy come to be? Remember, Kant does not publish his first major work in philosophy until 1787, 3 years after this. He's at that time 57 years old, his first work of philosophy, right? The Chinaman of Königsberg, so it was called him, right? He never, the women used to set their timepieces, that story, right? Because he was so punctual.
His walks.
Space and time in the morning, they
He
would say.
really wasn't a contemporary of Diderot, one of my favorite people.
Well, he was a contemporary of Diderot.
He didn't know, did he interact with Diderot?
Well, I don't know if he interacted, but he was a contemporary. They knew of each other. He certainly knew the
I
encyclopedia.
believe died before this was published, I
Yeah,
think.
the great story of
I read
Diderot was
biography.
Catherine the Great.
Diderot was someone
Yeah.
I like very much.
You know the story about Catherine the Great?
About what?
Catherine
Oh,
the
yeah,
Great.
the light, she
Yeah.
bought all
She
these
bought
books.
all the books because he was broke, but she said, I'm not going to give you I'm going to give you back your library, and when you die, it comes to me because I want you to continue to work. Yeah, very interesting moment, Catherine the Great in Russia. That.
She was
And these are the people that went into Russia in different ways, right? I mean, the Chernovsky circle of what is to be done were very Kantian and Diderot, French Enlightenment and the German Enlightenment. They were very, very important in this group. I mean, think about this little period of 1750, Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, all in their heyday. You have the materialists, La Mettrie,
The encyclopedias.
yes, the encyclopedias and the early materialists, the mechanical materialists, all working in France. Man is machine, which is going to come back, I think, in terms of mechanical materialism. The more we get into robotized culture, people will start reading Man is machine again, right, as a kind of precursory text. And think about this too, then you have Kant in Germany working on this. The Jewish question happened. In Scotland, you have Adam Smith writing The Wealth of Nations, right? Which again is a very sophisticated book where the labor theory of value is proposed. Labor is the source of all wealth. That's happening, etc. Right?
That's in Smith.
That's in Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, right? And then you have Bentham writing the Panopticon, rewards and punishments to the system. So think about this, broadly, that this is what's going on, and they're all aware of each other. Thomas Paine in the United States is writing Common Sense, which is of a kind of critique, right? All this too, right? In the sense of the government, who's forced to leave, right? And Jefferson himself in Jeffersonian democracy is very influenced by the French Enlightenment, and somewhat about Kant, right? Yeah. Even though he was a slaveholder, he said if the government's not doing its job, you overthrow it. Jefferson called for revolution.
The most radical of the so-called founding fathers, he's not even considered, is Tom Paine. He's another hero.
Yes, of course.
Tom Paine was ostracized
Right.
by the founding fathers.
Right.
Literally.
So,
literally.
yeah, no, that's true. So the question is, critique is necessary, and what does critique do? It lays the ground, it defines what conditions, right, under which reason can be known, and asks the question, again, what can be known, what can be done, and what can we hope for? This is what critique does. And these are the three Kantian questions, right? What can we know? What are the conditions for the possibility of our knowledge? What are we to do with this? And what can we hope for? Right? And so you have out of that, you have many moments, right? Epistemology, modern epistemological questions, of which you get epistemological breaks, such in Althusser, of which a whole long history is done. What is to be done? Certainly Chernovsky in 1848, the circle, the library, it was known, the conspiracy, up to Lenin, right? In the turn of in the early 1900s. And what can be hope? Ernst Bloch wrote a book, The Principle of Hope, in 3 volumes. What can we hope for? What is utopia about, right? Ultimately, You know, what can we really hope? So Enlightenment then becomes not only the freeing from one's tutelage, right, or self-imposed immaturity, right, on the individual level before it goes to the collective level. It's really the age of critique, right? That's what's really going on, is the age of critique. What it opens up is critique, critical philosophy. This is its contribution, I think, yeah, right? So, and it becomes this kind of crossroads of both critical reflection on the time and then the reflection on history itself, right? Right? Okay? Yeah? So this is important. And how do we get into modernity, you know, from this, right? Who are the thinkers of modernity? Sentimental Education, Madame Bovary, of Flaubert. Painter of Modern Life, Baudelaire, right? These are the thinkers of modernity. Where does modernity really begin? For Roland Barthes, it begins with, you know, Madame Bovary, Bovaryism, right? For Baudelaire, it begins with the fleeting, the ephemeral, right, etc., and the contingent.
I was supposed to read, I never read it, A Sentimental Education. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I've read it.
Yeah, maybe I should.
Yeah,
It was-
I think
it
there
was
are
part
better
of the
things to
Flaubert
read.
course, and I didn't read it, but I read the other things.
You know, Sartre's study of Flaubert was entitled The Idiot of the Family. The Idiot of the Family. 4 volumes on Flaubert. The Idiot of the Family.
His brother was like the perfect guy, right?
Yes, right, that's correct. Yeah.
Or
yeah.
his favorite son, I guess.
So really, in a way, what Kant is providing us here with, I think, or you know, is multiple fold. But one thing is that the age of enlightenment is really the age of critique. It's the beginning of critique. It's the beginning of critical philosophy. It creates a new philosophical ethos, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is a revolution. You know, when people say it's a Copernican revolution, it is. Kant has put a Copernican revolution into place in ethics and in how we think about knowledge, you know, in many ways. Hegel, the idealist tradition, will start to, you know, take this on, but certainly borrows heavily from it in many ways. So, anyway, you see what else I could really say about this. And Kant becomes the philosopher. You know, listen, for Kant, the real question is how do we get out of experience in order to ground a world of freedom? How do we get out of the experiential to have really freedom, right? And this may be going back to where Sean opened up about, you know, an hour and 15 minutes ago, hour and a half ago, is the use of public reason, in a way, the reasoning for reason's sake, right? What is really going on in this, right? So, right? So he is idealist. You know, an idealist in this context really means that the objects of experience that we have, the objects of experience in space and time, are no more than appearances or representations. It's very important to keep in mind about idealism. The ideas of the idealists are not the appearances, they are entities that ground those appearances. So you have the idea underneath the logic of appearance, right? I mean, I'll, you know, maybe next week do a diagram. And which are the limited realm of experience is contained, right? This is where it's contained, right? So Kant very much is very much like Plato. It's the archetypal or archetypical bases of things, the ideas itself, which are beyond the senses, and the, you know, the concepts of understanding, right? Yeah, this is a major thing we'll talk about with Hegel, is the movement of sense and understanding and sense. So experience for Kant is the mother of illusion, right? Reason is the only thing that can take away the illusion. So Freud, for example, in The Future of an Illusion, is very Kantian in the last chapter. I don't know if you've read that book, but one of those most beautiful crafted metapsychological works, you know, in which he says, our God is logos, reason, right? And this is where he ends up in the dialogue with the priest Oscar Pfister, right? That reason becomes our God, the logos, right? And the small gains of science versus that, or the small gains of critique, if you will, in the Kantian sense, the gradualism is much better than the regress into religious, or the logic of illusion, right? So Kant's really in some ways critiquing religion in a very subtle way, even though he's playing to, the religious toleration of the day with Frederick of Prussia. It's always good to read philosophers as being very clever on these kind of matters, that they can use this, right, but at the same time have much more of a revolutionary or at least radical agenda. Not all philosophers. Some philosophers are about control, but I don't think Kant was really about control or ideological control. I think he has an early critique of ideology through the I think accompanies all my representations. He's really thinking through these idealities at many levels. Right? He's really thinking it through. So reason, right, as understanding is to the senses, reason is to the understanding, right? So you have this movement in the critique. You're not really seeing it here, but understanding is part of the public reason, the ability to use, reason publicly, right? And, understanding is an advance over the senses, right, on the sensorial and our world of the data of the givens, right? But reason is really the next stage of understanding. So you have this triad always working in Kant between reason, sense, and understanding. This is really the kind of key that's going on in the critique of pure reason, right? So, anyway,
I liked your use of the word individuation because that's such a cornerstone of Jungian psychology, the individuation.
well, I'm using it in a different sense, but I know its sense with Jung. Yes, absolutely. I understand.
Jung's individuation process is
Right.
a more complete rendering of it.
Right. Okay, good. Any other thoughts about this piece? I mean, from you?
I like the phrase, Caesar is not above the grammarian. It makes me think Trump is not above the free press. I think.
Well, I don't know if we have a free press, but yes,
I
it's a, yeah,
I think
you're
there's a
right.
bit of an analogy.
Yeah, no, I got you, yeah.
Grammarians are not just study grammar, but any
Right.
thinkers and writers, right?
Right, of course.
That's what it means.
Yes, of course. Right.
These endnotes are very good. I don't have that in the one that I printed out just had the one you printed out has these endnotes, which I like very much.
Yeah, I mean, again, you're dealing with an extremely learned man, a man who lived the life of the mind to the core, right? I mean, Kant lived an extremely disciplined life, extremely, to put it mildly. Every day was planned out perfectly, right? From the time he would work, to the time he would eat, to the time he would go to the university.
People in Königsberg told the time by when
Yeah,
he left
we
the house.
mentioned that. Yeah. She was there. Yeah. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Time travel.
I got that from another philosophy course that I was allowed to audit. That's
Right.
where I got
If
that.
you look at footnote number 3, these are like organizations like Erie and Democracy at Work that were formed as conspiratorial moments. Dare to Know was a motto adopted by the Society of the Friends of Truth, which is a circle of the German Enlightenment. Does anyone know where Society for the Friends of Truth comes from? Yeah. We're friends to Plato, friends of the forms, but we're greater friends to the truth, Aristotle, in the Nicomachean Ethics. Yeah, we're friends of the forms and the ideas, right? But we're more friends of the truth, right? So, anyway, it's interesting, right? And then the minority here, by the way, those of you who read Stiegler, he uses minority all throughout States of Shock. His book on education, in the age of stupidity and, This is a great thing. The Unmündigkeit, right, literally means minority, in which one is an ability to make decisions for oneself. And it's not the way we think of minority and majority. He's talking about a
A
minor.
minority of one,
Yes, exactly.
a radical
Yeah.
minority.
Yeah. So it's interesting what the author says. The point is, by virtue of understanding and reason, men have the inherent right and ability to make all intellectual, political, and religious decisions for themselves. And you can see the Platonic, listen, I mean, this is a very long story in the history of philosophy, but the a priori in Kant is very connected to somewhat of the Pythagorean notion of a recollection early on. I'm sorry about the phone. Yeah, anyway. So this is it. So that they not do it is a function of certain and implicit rights they make in regard to exercising rights and developing capacities. So most people do not develop to their capacity. I taught Aristotle today on the soul and its ability to, become what is happiness. Well, for Aristotle, it's living in accordance with the capacity of the soul, right? One has to live up to one's possibility. To go to Lacan, to follow one's desire, right? To really be true or faithful to one's desire. This is what produces sickness. If you're not, this is what produces neurosis, right? Yeah.
I need to use
Okay, no problem. Yeah, no problem.
before we're expelled.
Yeah. So anyway, so this is a very good. Yeah, I mean, you learn a lot too from I think his Ted Humphrey's footnotes. Very good translations, right? And then he talks. Number 8 is good too. Kant distinguishes between two classes of concepts: those that we could schematize, figure, directly represent in experience, the intuition, and those we must symbolize, that indirectly